Michael rather implied I talk about historiography, and I will in part, but the title that Nigel Bigger gave me was about views of the Great War, and I will speak a bit more generally than to talk about historians solely. I should also say that because I've been talking about this so much during the course of the centenary, I apologize in advance to anybody who's heard some of these themes before, and particularly this subject is one which I have addressed on rather a lot of occasions in the last 5 years. The war may be over for some, but for you it is not. I begin with this, partly, of course, to be provocative. I don't say, of course. Does anyone know where that is? The previous photograph I had, yes. It is indeed the Cambridge War Memorial. So that is the War Memorial to the dead of the University of Cambridge, the city of Cambridge, the county of Cambridgeshire, and the Isle of Ely. And it shows in part, of course, that they do things better there than they do here. Hasten to add, of course, I was at Cambridge, not at Oxford. Now, the reason for showing that is partly to use it as a peg on which to highlight some contrasting British views of the First World War. This statue, now the game's been given away, I can go back to a more contemporary photograph. This memorial used to stand on the road that runs from the station to Hills Road to go into the centre of town. It stood at the crossroads. And with the passage of time, even when I went up in 1968, it was quite hard to see it because there were enough road signs, traffic lights, other warning impedimenta to obscure the view. And if you did go and try and get close to it, you'd probably be killed by a passing vehicle anyway. So that's its position on the road adjacent to the station. It was designed by a man called Robert Tate Mackenzie, and it was unveiled in 1922. Now, I don't want to begin just with this, but the first book I wish to refer to is not a work of military history. It's a book called An Unsuitable Job for a Woman by P.D. James, a whodunit, published indeed in 1972. And it pivots not, for those of you who are aficionados of P.D. James, around Adam Dalgleish, but a female detective called Cordelia Gray. And in this novel, Cordelia Gray is hot on the trail of the murderer, and she drives down Hills Road, and this is the description from P.D. James, past the vigorous memorial stone of a young soldier striding to his death. Now, this memorial is indeed vigorous. Any of you who are Guard Sergeant Majors will know that that is way beyond the regulation pace. If a pace stick were out there, this chap would be on a charge straight away. But much more importantly, he is striding to the station, going to his death? No. He is striding back from the station. He is coming into town, not going out of town. The model for this memorial was the adjutant of the Cambridge OTC at the time, who had been an undergraduate at Christ, a man called Keith Hamilton. And what it embodies is not a soldier departing for the front in 1914, but a soldier returning in 1919. And of course, his vigor manifests life more than it manifests death. And if you look at it, and I'm sorry, because this is a 1920s photograph, that's why the color one's there too, but if you look at it, you can see he carries some of the symbols of victory. There is a laurel wreath suspended from his rifle barrel. Also suspended from his rifle barrel is a German Pickelhaube, a captured German helmet. And he is returning from the war triumphant. When we look at war memorials these days, we forget that in the 1920s, the early 1920s in particular, many of them, if they had by then been erected, were accompanied by the booty of victory. When you read the terms of the Armistice and the negotiations which required the Germans to surrender all their equipment, you need to remember what happened to that equipment. And the stuff that was genuinely redundant was handed over to local communities. I bet Michael doesn't remember this, but St. Andrews was given a tank. And it was not alone in being given a tank. And you might see a memorial like this with a German field howitzer or something stuck next door to it. New Zealand got very cross because shipping costs meant that they just got 1 or 2 helmets and rifles, nothing heavier or more substantial. But the idea here, and the point I want to raise by showing this, of course, is that what we are looking at here is a mixed message in terms of what this war conveys. That sense of genuine uncertainty manifested almost the moment the armistice was signed about where the world would end up, what would happen, what had been achieved. The war had been won, but maybe the peace was being lost. But as yet, no fixed image as to what this war might betoken. The fact that Cordelia Gray should have so misinterpreted the War Memorial is perhaps forgivable, certainly in a fictional character. The fact that P.D. James, writing in 1972, got it wrong seems to me less forgivable, but in some respects understandable. Less forgivable because she was a pupil at Cambridge High School for Girls, and she must have passed this statue very often and should have known exactly the direction in which it was traveling, which the soldier was traveling. But what it perhaps betokens is that in 1972, of course, another image of this war had become settled. The idea that this war was indeed wasteful, futile, that it shouldn't have been fought, and that it carried the penumbra, really, of, no, penumbra, I don't know if it's the right word, but the idea that war was something to be avoided, and the First World War embodied that above all. Something, of course, which in the era of the Cold War made very powerful sense. So what P.D. James was doing in 1972 was looking at this memorial with the eyes of 1972 rather than the eyes of 1922. And part of what I want to say this evening is that how we think about this war, indeed how we probably think about many wars, and perhaps how historians think about events in the past, full stop, is more colored, of course, by our own concerns and our own perspectives than is colored by those who are themselves or have themselves been participants in it. It's particularly powerful, I think, in the case of what we do by way of remembrance, because, of course, every year we update remembrance. You may notice that this is now a more tranquil scene. It's not just that the lighting is good and that the sun is setting, but precisely because you couldn't get close to the War Memorial. In 2012, it was decided to move it away from being essentially in the middle of a road junction and put it just across the road to the entrance to the Botanic Gardens. And when that happened, the firm responsible for it, Morgan Sindall, celebrated the event, and the area director said, to quote him from the Cambridge Evening News, "The sacrifices our armed forces made in 2 world wars and in all the conflicts since remain very much in the public mind, and our team is proud to contribute to the task of giving Cambridge a safe, contemplative space to allow people to pay their respects." In other words, we have taken the First World War, the poppy, the war memorials, the 11th of November, the 2-minute silence, all the forms of commemoration from that conflict, and applied them to every conflict since. And part of the problem we have with thinking about the First World War is that it carries the burden of the subsequent wars that the United Kingdom has fought, as well as of the First World War specifically. In other words, we are continually changing how we think about this, and I'll come back to that point at the end. What I want to do in the course of this evening is take a series of waypoints to show how our views have changed. To begin with 1918, to move on to 1928, and the 10th anniversary of the end of the First World War, then to move to the 50th anniversary, and finally, of course, to the centenary itself. It's worth remembering, partly because when we were marking the end of the war on the 11th of November 2018, it was very hard to get this point home, either to the clergy involved in services or indeed to the wider business which was in the hands of the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, that actually, of course, the 11th of November was characterized not by 2 minutes silence, nor by a sense of reverence and respect for the dead, although certainly there was respect for the dead as part of what was going on, but was accompanied by an enormous cacophony of noise in most cities, by a great deal of celebration, and of course by a sense for those who had survived of both relief on the one hand and uncertainty on the other. Uncertainty is what was going to happen next. There's a wonderful memoir by a New Zealand soldier who subsequently became Labour MP for Greymouth in the South Island, and he describes, he got a DCM at Messines in 1917, and he then lost an arm in the Spring Offensive of 1918. He was convalescing at Brockenhurst, and he heard the news of the end of the war and decided the place to be was in London. So he went to the station, got on the train to Waterloo, and says the next time he can remember anything, it was the 13th of November. He wasn't terribly sure who the girl he was with had, or quite why his head was quite as sore as it proved to be. And that is, there's a fair amount of that, jollification and celebration. And there was a great deal of it going on across all parts of society in Britain. If you go to the Bodleian, do look at the diary kept by the Reverend Andrew Clark, who was rector of Great Leys in Essex. And Andrew Clark was the sort of hoarder and collector of information that involved probably extended to collecting bus tickets and cereal packets and various other things. But he recorded everything that happened in his parish, day by day. And of course, he therefore provides a very clear account of how it was marked, how the end of the war was marked on the 11th of November. And what it involves is essentially schoolboys deciding to take the day off, irrespective, and their teachers very sensibly concluding that it was just as well to give them a holiday rather than trying to impose discipline. An enormous number of flags being raised, bands playing, and so on and so forth. So a mood of celebration. As I said, I don't for a moment want to suggest there weren't also moments of introspection. But I think, as we so often tell the story of Wilfred Owen's mother hearing the news of his death at the same time as hearing the bells ringing for the Armistice, we need to remember that actually the big issue on the 11th of November, the big issues concern the living, precisely what was going to happen to them, what they were going to do, and indeed how they would carry forward their views and consolidate their views of this war, because they would have a big part in shaping how we now think about the war and the way in which we approach it. During the 1920s, two struggles were going on in terms of the representation of this war and its commemoration. And both, I think, had a profound influence on how the war was remembered. The first was essentially a debate between the church and more secular forces. The British Empire, after all, was a multi-faith empire, and the Imperial War Graves Commission, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, as it became, was very anxious to mark the equality in death of all those who had served the British Army and to recognize all faiths as well as recognizing those who had none. And the Church of England in particular was not very happy with that approach. And in particular, of course, it was thanks to their unhappiness that, in a way, they re-sacralized, is that an appropriate verb, the commemoration by burying the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey, putting the unknown warrior in a sacred space, in a church space. And that, in some respects, is a direct answer to that heathen memorial halfway out Whitehall, the cenotaph, derived from ancient Greece, and an embodiment not of the religious, but of the secular. So there's that debate going on. Embodied in some ways, and as I've got the photograph, I might just well show it to you. By that, I don't expect anybody to know where that is, except I was there first thing this morning. Not that I was so organized to get it into a PowerPoint presentation by then. That is the War Memorial in Lockerbie, where I get my train down when I come down to Oxford from Scotland. The point is, of course, that the angel and victory cover both the secular and the sacred quite conveniently. You think how often you see that, and you realize how the ambiguity of whether the angel and Nike plays in terms of pleasing both sides of this equation, you hope at the same time. And the other issue that was going on that was part of this debate was, were you concerned with what we might call Armistice Day, in other words, that moment of celebration where the war ended, that moment of victory, or were you concerned with remembrance, with grieving those who had not survived? And that debate was also gendered very often in terms of the soldier who felt that his responsibility in relation to his dead mates was to honor their memory by living life to the full, and also supporting war memorials, which too often we fail to see when we visit places because they have been lost to our gaze, because they're not war memorials in a conventional sense. Things like scholarships at colleges, things like libraries, things like public parks, things like bus shelters, all of which are very often there because there are many in the community who say we need to give something that takes us forward, that contributes to the next generation, and therefore has another purpose in what's going on. So my point here, and this affects what I'm going to say about the historiography of the 20s, is that the meaning of this war is still contested throughout the 1920s, and it's contested in part, of course, because although I've said the First World War ended on the 11th of November, 1918, I'm saying that largely for convenience, because as far as the British Army was concerned, it certainly hadn't come home by 100 years ago today. There was still the possibility that the armistice would not be renewed, that Germany would not sign the peace terms. The blockade of Germany was still being sustained. There was formally still a state of hostilities. And quite apart from that, as to whether Germany would actually agree terms, the British Army was actively engaged from Ireland to India. Most war memorials will have the date 1919 on, not 1918, and that's not just because it's not till 1919 the peace treaty is signed. It is because soldiers are dying. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission responsibility carries on until 1921. And I think I'm right in saying, but as you can see, Shantanu Das is here, and he can probably tell me I'm wrong, but the last Indian soldiers to return from the Middle East is not till 1923, that the commitment, because of course actually the last treaty, peace treaty, is that signed with Turkey at Lausanne. So that sense that peace is not truly engaged in 1918 adds to the uncertainty as to how to understand this war. Now, if you think of the war literature that comes out in this period, what's striking about it is none of it is, or very little of it, is now read as war literature. I'm going to generalize like fury, and specialists will, of course, quite reasonably pick holes in this. But the books that come out quickly in 1919 are not books we would book in the canon of war literature, but remain enormously important in British understanding of how this war would be interpreted. Eric Ludendorff's war memoirs, for example, written in Sweden, in exile. The phrase, repeated endlessly last year about the Battle of Amiens, in order to explain the 100 Days and the so-called British victory on the Western Front, the Black Day of the German Army, the Battle of Amiens on the 8th of August. That is Ludendorff's phrase, written in 1919, and still carrying purchase to this day. And yet, of course, we don't see those memoirs as part of the canon of war literature. Hindenburg's memoirs came out at almost the same time, Falkenhayn's too. So the German generals got in pretty quick. They were quick off the draw. They had quite a lot to have to answer for, so they got on with it. British generals came later, and I'll come on to them in a moment. But in terms of less exalted people, the stories that tended to sell well, the market that was ready, was stories of daring do. It was stories of escape, stories of espionage, stories very often of aerial combat. In other words, it took you away from what we would now see as the dominant experience of the First World War, which was trench warfare on the Western Front, the ordinary, in inverted commas, experience of the Western Front. All this began to change by my second waypoint, which is 1928, and the 10th anniversary of the Armistice. By then, many publishers were saying that the market for war literature had dried up, people were ready to move on, and it was time to put the war behind you. Some people see the big change that happened in wider socioeconomic terms, that the slump is important, that the economic crash means that those who've come back from this war, put their lives back together again, found careers, refound their families or created families, pointed themselves forward, suddenly find themselves set back, and that in itself triggers them in terms of retrospection to return and rethink what the war had achieved and where they stood. But what I think is important that is even in 1928, even at the 10th anniversary, there is an ambivalence about what this war means. That's the year in which R.C. Sherriff's play, Journey's End, is first produced. Sherriff, of course, himself, a veteran of the Western Front. And I think many people, when they go to see that play, and it's regularly revived, so it continues to have an important part in how we understand this war, remember, above all, Act 3, for understandable reasons. The climax, which is to be the German offensive, the 21st of March, 1918, and we know all these chaps in this dugout are not going to come out alive from that experience. But if that's what you think about, then you can be very surprised by Act 1 and Act 2 with all that sort of wry observation about class distinction, with a great deal of humor, with a playing of really quite well written lines, it seems to me, in capturing the sort of thing that actually kept people going in these difficult circumstances. And it's interesting that when veterans went to see that play, they picked up on what for them had been important in the war. And that differed, of course, because they each had different memories of what they had been through. So, as one critic wrote, if I can find the right words, some saw in the play a message of support for peace organizations. On the other hand, many who despised pacifist talk and admired the military virtues among all others could also find encouragement in the play, which does show ordinary men doing their duty and sticking it because it's the only decent thing a man can do. Thus the play spoke to many kinds of people, both ex-soldier and civilian, patriot and internationalists, young and old. Now that ambivalence is what goes between, let's say, 1928 and the early 1930s. That what you then have an understanding of is the war increasingly seen in terms of that stereotype of waste, futility, and so on. And it begins, as perhaps it should do, with a returning trope in the British understanding of this war, which is this fixation with generalship. No other country, it seems to me, that fought in this war is as hung up with the question of the competence or incompetence of generals. I was very struck during the centenary period that France in 2014 was happy to refurbish the statue of Foch by Victoria Station, and in 2018 the British government was ready to have a service or an act of commemoration there to mark the moment when Foch became the Allied Generalissimo. Foch is a neutral figure in this, and perhaps even a positive figure. But Douglas Haig, keep it back in Oxford, of course, as a Brasenose man, Douglas Haig is immediately problematic for us. And this is striking, and must have been striking to many who remembered Haig. When Haig died in 1928, appropriately enough, in January, thousands filed past his body as it lay in state, first in London and then in Edinburgh before it went for committal at Dryburgh Abbey. The Dean of the Thistle, because Haig was a Knight of the Thistle, wrote to his son, Doig Haig. Doig was a Christchurch man, who was then in 1928, he was born in 1917, would have been not yet 11, he must have been 10, because he was born during the Third Battle of Ypres. The Dean of the Thistle wrote to Doig Haig, "You have had such a wonderful father, one of the greatest Scotsmen that ever lived, and he has left you with a name which will always be held in honour, not only in this country, but throughout the whole world." It's been remarkable, I serve on the Scottish Centenary Committee, that we have not once discussed Douglas Haig in the 4 years of the centenary. And I've mentioned just now the Brasenose connection. Is there anyone from Brasenose here? What's happened to the plaque marking Haig? Has it been reinstated? There used to be a plaque. There's a portrait in Hall, but there used to be a plaque by the Porter's Lodge. And in the 60s, it went down into the cellars somewhere. And there was a debate going on in the college in 2014 as to whether it should be brought up again. But for many, that is just a step too far. It is, for somebody who was a national hero in his own lifetime, it is extraordinary that he has so quickly disappeared from view and has not been marked. And one of the things I find striking, having been brought up in Edinburgh, is there was a marvellous equestrian statue of Haig that used to be on the Esplanade, which has now been moved inside the castle into what's called Hospital Square, where it's almost invisible. The justification for that is not shame about Haig, but the seating for the tattoo and the fact that the statue gets in the way. But that statue was given by an Indian businessman in gratitude for Haig's services to the British Empire. I don't think that he ever intended it to be placed in as obscure a position and as thoroughly neglected as it now seems to be. Now, why did this issue of generalship become so important in how we view the First World War? And I think that process is attributable to two direct causes. The first is that just about at the time of Haig's death, in 1928, the debunking of British generals began principally because a man called Charles Cornwall produced an edited version of the diary of Sir Henry Wilson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, at the end of the First World War, and the Director of Military Operations at the beginning of the First World War. Henry Wilson was a general of whom it was said by Edward Spears that the sight of a politician would arouse in him a state of sexual excitement. So, as you can imagine, his diary is pretty good racy reading. I mean, he's an Ulster Unionist. He was about to join he was about to stand as an MP, as a candidate for MP when he left the army. Didn't quite make it because he went to unveil the memorial at the Paddington Station Memorial, the one of the soldier reading. He went to unveil the memorial at Paddington Station, came back to his house in Eaton Square. A couple of IRA chaps accosted him, and instead of opening his front door smartly, going in and closing it, he made the big mistake of trying to draw his sword And they, of course, had revolvers, end of Henry Wilson. That early death was precisely why his diary could come out in 1928. And what it revealed was a politicking general, an ambitious general, a general who rubbished other generals, and showed the sort of the ambition and the jockeying for position, which, of course, gave generals a bad name. So it just happened by chance that that was the first of the British generals' memoirs, and that it was the one that would not actually do British generalship much good. Douglas Haig had no time for Henry Wilson, and certainly didn't like his politicking, and would have been appalled to know that in some ways his own reputation got swept up with Wilson. But what it did was feed the mind of a young historian, Basil Liddell Hart. Liddell Hart wrote a number of books at the turn of the late 20s, early 30s. A book called Reputations, which is a study of individual commanders, and then a book that was at first called The Real War, then became a history of the World War, and of course after the Second World War, a history of the First World War. And there is a document in the Liddell Hart papers where he's clearly roughing out potential titles for this book. And it is titles like No General, No Napoleon. In other words, he was obsessed with the absence of an effective commander in this war. He wrote, I have to say, a biography of Foch that had a pretty good go at Foch. So it's not that Foch was exempt from that, but it required a British author to do it. So Liddell Hart began the process of debunking the generals. The other thing that happened in 1928, and you get my clicker, because you're going to get another picture. That's another very discordant sort of war memorial, sidetracking. That's the Cameroons Memorial in Kelvin Grove in Glasgow, designed by an officer who served with the Cameroonians. But the appearance of All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front, originally written, obviously, as Investor Nick Neuers, in a part work for the Vossische Zeitung in 1928, but produced as a book in 1929, immediately translated into about 20 different languages, a worldwide bestseller, and then, crucially, made into this, a film, the first talkie film to win an Oscar. The film was originally made as a silent film, but came out, the producer realized that he was going to be stuck with old technology. It came out in this new format. So here is this film. It comes out, and the importance of the film and of the book is that it encapsulates the frontline experience as it is understood across national boundaries. This, after all, is a film made in Hollywood about the enemy, about the Germans. It implies a degree of commonality in terms of the trench experience. We have reached a point now in the war when actually the stories are not stories of daring do and of escaping and of flying, but stories of the initiated who have seen trench warfare, who can bear testimony to it, and who therefore have a unique authorial voice which carries gravitas and significance. Edmund Blunden, when he wrote the introduction to Undertones of War, which belongs to this exactly same period, writes in the foreword, I'm going to paraphrase it, I'm afraid I can't remember the exact words, but writes, I've been going over this journey many, many times trying to find what I'm going to say, and I realize only those who have gone the same journey will understand what I'm talking about. In other words, the vast bulk of his readers are not initiated in this. They won't understand it. I think he changed his view because actually the book sold rather well, of course, and there's clearly evidence that he was planning an illustrated version of the book, which suggests there was a wider market. Another Oxford connection, of course, because he became professor of poetry and was a fellow of Merton. But the point here is that what the veterans were saying is we have gone this journey and you have not. And that means that many of the books that, particularly in the English language, we associate with the war experience, that colour our views, British views, of this war, London being one of the more famous, but self-evidently Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves, and others, belong to this generation of war literature, that this 10-year gap where the focus goes onto the frontline experience. What is interesting is that there is a link between Remarque and the points I was making about generals. Because Ian Hamilton, another Scottish general who commanded at Gallipoli, commanded the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, wrote to Remarque to congratulate him on his book. And Remarque wrote back and said, jolly kind of you to see such polite things. Hamilton said, this is the book about the First World War. And Remarque said, actually, the book about the First World War cannot be written for the first 100 years after it, because we still don't know what it means, and we don't have a hold on it. So actually Remarque was remarkably realistic about that. And what he captured, for my money, is actually less the problems of those who are at the front or of the frontline experience, and more the issue that Remarque and many others had after the war, which was how to digest that experience and to reintegrate themselves into life after the war, as opposed to life lived during the war. So here we have, formed in the aftermath of 1928, a sense of this war losing its purpose, a sense that it hadn't achieved very much, a sense that it couldn't be explained in conventional military history terms. A man called Ian Hay, Beath was his real name, Ian Hay, his nom de plume, who became famous during the First World War for writing a book called The First 100,000. He'd served with the 10th Battalion, the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, in a new army battalion, had been at Loos, published The First 100,000 in 1916. It was serialized in Blackwood's magazine, and he was then sent, because it was so popular, on a lecture tour of the US in order to encourage the US to come into the war. In other words, he was taken in hand by British propaganda. And he wrote, after the war, a number of further works. And in particular, in 1931, he wrote the guidebook to the new Scottish National War Memorial, which had just been opened in Edinburgh Castle. And what he wrote in 1931, I think, captures a great deal of where things had now got to. These are his words. Armistice Day, talking about the late 1920s, as I say, published in 1931, Armistice Day ceased to exist as a restaurant orgy. The 2-minute silence took its place. I've never been to a restaurant orgy, sadly, but you know. The 2-minute silence took its place. And with silence, albeit a silence with an echo as it reverberated on the stone memorials scattered throughout the world, the First World War began to, it's interesting, he called it the First World War in 1931, the First World War began to acquire the connotations of waste and futility that have been its dominant trope ever since. So the war had become a war without purpose, one in which Europe tore itself apart, an insignificant quarrel in the Balkans, in which 10 million soldiers then lost their lives, squabbling over tiny patches of a muddy wasteland. And the point here is that that was only reinforced between 1928 and the 50th anniversary of the First World War. I was at school in 1964, so I remember this moment pretty clearly. And what I think also is important is two people I've just mentioned, as well as many others, Eric Maria Remarque and Basil Little Hart, were still alive and were still shaping the output that was generated by that centenary moment. It's also important to remember that history, the writing by professional historians of this war, on this war, had not yet reached the level of sophistication that opening the archives would enable. In 1964, the archives of the First World War were only just being opened for 1914 that year, because the 50-year rule was still in place. In 1967, so 3 years into the 50th anniversary, the government changed the law. 30-year rule, which is what we currently have, was applied. And the effect of that, and I remember this very clearly as a research student at Cambridge in the early 70s, is that those of my contemporaries who were interested in military history and international history had jumped straight to the interwar period, because what was much more interesting and important was the Second World War than the First World War. So Harry Hensley is Professor of International History. He was not my supervisor, I say quickly, but he had this army of research students who were waiting for the next batch of archives to come out in order to write about British interwar defense policy. And the First World War, because of the jump from a 50-year rule to a 30-year rule, was simply bypassed. The serious scholarly work on the social history of the war was more easy to address, and here people like Arthur Marwick and others blazed a trail in terms of revisiting and opening that out, and that could, of course, be done from sources that were not affected by the Public Records Act. But the military and international history of the war had to wait to the 1980s, to David French's trilogy on the strategy of the First World War, to the work of historians like Dominic Graham, Trevor Wilson, Robert Pryor, and Tim Travers, all of whom were the first to get into the archives. Now, what that meant was that the 50th anniversary of the war could still be dominated by Little Hart and by people who were influenced by him. And there are two obvious works that reflected that. One was Leon Wolfe's In Flanders Fields, which is an attack on Haig's conduct, the Third Battle of Ypres. James Howard Johnson, fellow of Corpus, I remember saying, he's as Haig's grandson, that he remembered going home and saying to his mother, Haig's daughter, he'd just been reading this wonderful book at school called In Flanders Fields, and then he realized, which was published in 1961, he realized that it didn't go down terribly well at home. The foreword to that was written not by Basil Little Hart, but by J.F.C. Fuller. And in the same year, in 1961, very much with Little Hart's support, Alan Clark, the future MP, wrote a book called The Donkeys, which was an account not so much of Haig's generalship, but of Sir John French's generalship as it focused on 1915. Little Hart was the overall editor for the Purnell's History of the War, which came out as a part work in the 1960s. And the only counter to this, really, came from John Terraine, who wrote a book controversially entitled Douglas Haig, The Educated Soldier, tribute, no doubt, to Brasenose, which came out in 1963. Haig, the Haig Diary, was available to Terraine, so to that extent he looked at a primary source. But broadly speaking, like everybody else, he was still dependent on the memoir literature. And like everybody else at that juncture, he could not, any more than could Leon Wolfe or Alan Clark, go to the papers. Now, I mentioned John Terraine because the other thing that happened that I think shaped British understandings of this war, I'm going on, am I okay for time, Michael? How am I doing? Very much. Yeah. I'll speed up, yeah. The other thing that happened was the appearance of the veterans of the war in the BBC television series, The Great War, for which John Terraine was one of the historians. Max Hastings, the young Max Hastings, was also working on it. Corelli Barnett was involved with it. 24-part series, far bigger than anything the corporation did for the centenary, and a path-breaking documentary in its day. It didn't conform to the standards that we would now have. They had this fixed view. I really need a clip here to show this point. Because Germany is to the east of Britain, in case you hadn't noticed, every time Germans appear, they must attack from the right-hand side of the screen, so you know exactly what's going on. And the British, because they're coming from the west to go to the French, must always attack from the left-hand side of the screen, which makes for an awful lot of left-handed soldiers because you're having to flip the footage. And of course, there's no attempt to apply footage to the right year, so you have soldiers in tin hats in 1914, all that sort of stuff. So in all sorts of ways, it was not up to the standards which we hope television producers, of course, apply today. But why it mattered was the veterans themselves were recorded. If you've seen the Peter Jackson film, which was produced for the centenary, many of those voices, apart from the lip sync, the parts which I think are the real achievement of that film, many of the recorded voices were recorded for that television series. Charles Carrington, Sidney Rogerson, many famous names from the First World War were recorded for that series. And one of the feelings I got watching that film, interested to know what you think, is it actually took me straight back to the 50th anniversary and to the television series. So the veterans, these initiate generation, were able to re-stamp their authority on the history of the war. They'd been there, and they were speaking about it, and they spoke with authority which nobody else could have, and that was part of the narrative. But there was also, of course, the narrative of protest, because the 50th anniversary came just after the Cold War, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when allegedly J.F. Kennedy had been reading Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August. I've never been able quite to work that out, not just because I think Kennedy had other things to do during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also because Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August hadn't yet been published. But anyway, allegedly, this is why Kennedy behaved with prudence and common sense, because he realized the war happened, in inverted commas, by accident, and any competent president should avoid that. The fact that Sidney Fay taught exactly that at Harvard in the late 1930s may have been more important than the fact that Barbara Tuchman wrote it. But anyway, the point is that when, with the Cuban Missile Crisis so recent in people's minds, the power of the First World War was that it conveyed a war fought, it seemed, with enormous loss of life, but losses of life that would be dwarfed if there had been an all-out nuclear exchange. That Verdun and the Somme became the reality for which the Cold War was a metaphor. And that was the point that Joan Littlewood picked up when she produced Oh, What a Lovely War. I remember going to the Edinburgh Festival with my parents to see the original production, which was then put on in the Assembly Hall, the Church of Scotland Assembly Hall, and an apron theatre. And of course, as theatre, it was just wonderful how well it worked. But for those who've seen the film will know, and it happened on the stage production too, the casualty figures are running the whole time. So you're both laughing with the jokes, singing the songs, and seeing, of course, what the human cost of this is. And what I think that brings out, which so many Pofaced people at the time of the centenary couldn't remember, was that actually in the 60s, at the 50th anniversary, many people were not honoring these veterans, but criticizing them. And when I speak to French colleagues, they say, what I remember from May 68 is we went up to our grandfathers and said, why did you fight in this war? You were wasting your time. It was not a moment of honor, but a moment of condemnation. And for those who came from Australia and New Zealand, the service in Vietnam intensified that. In the early 1970s, there was real worry in Australia and New Zealand that both Anzac Day and Remembrance Sunday would disappear completely. Right, let me say finally just one or two words about where I think we might be now. I had hoped, I think, as the purist historian approaching the centenary, I had hoped that this might be a moment of historical re-education. And I think in some respects it has been that. But what surprised me was how we got there, because we didn't go to it logically. My feeling was that if you think of 64 to 68, a 4-year centenary, we had 4 years in which to educate a public who by then knew very little about the First World War. The Second World War had been created, particularly by Americans, as the good war, the war worth fighting, the war fought by the greatest generation, the war fought to save the Jews. I mean, all quite frankly, nonsense, sadly. The war did not save the Jews, self-evidently, and America did not enter the war to save the Jews any more than Britain entered the war to save the Jews. The war broke out in 1939 from Britain's point of view because of a problem in Eastern Europe, not totally unlike 1914 itself. So, but by inventing this version of the First World War, of course, it made the Great War even more irrelevant and even more futile. And the veterans by then, and there were still there was still some around when I first came to teach in Oxford. We used to have a veteran come to speak to the class that Adrian Gregory and I used to run on the First World War. For him, of course, there had been service in the Second World War. He knew this wasn't the war to end all wars. But there was both that, the legacy of the Second World War, and there was the further problem that the First World War was not on the national curriculum, except, of course, through the medium of English literature and Wilfred Owen's war poetry, which had become, certainly when I was at school, cult reading, but was not cult reading in the 1920s. Had become cult reading in the 1960s, partly, no doubt, thanks to Benjamin Britten and the War Requiem, but also, I think, partly on the back of Vietnam and the experience of Vietnam. So how, given the level of ignorance, and there were surveys in 2014 conducted by the British Council and by other bodies, which showed a number of remarkable things. First of all, many in Britain did not know Australia and New Zealand were in this war, so they didn't know Britain had an empire. Secondly, they thought that Hitler had started it. You can go on. I mean, the depth of ignorance. They didn't know who Franz Ferdinand was. They did know there had been a football match at Christmas 1914. So myths certainly have their capacity to establish a hold. And I hope that what we would do on the 4th of August 2014 is say the war's broken out, try and capture that moment which so many people realized on the 4th of August 1914 of the intensity of the experience, the uncertainty of what was going to happen, but the certainty that actually their lives were going to be changed in dramatic ways. We didn't do that. On the 4th of August 2014 in Glasgow, we went from Glasgow Cathedral down to the War Memorial in George Square in Glasgow to the Cenotaph, and we had a 2-minute silence. We laid wreaths, and it was Remembrance Sunday. It just happened to be in August. And that, I then realized, was how we got into this centenary, through remembrance. Richard Dannett turned up at I'm being recorded, I better watch it, sorry. Richard Dannett turned up as Constable of the Tower at a First World War Centenary Committee, clutching one of these poppies. And he said the plan was to put them in the moat of the Tower of London. And I said, I don't think this is appropriate because actually, if each of these poppies represents a dead soldier, they're still alive in July 2014. The last of them did not die probably till 1919, 1920, 1921. We need to go with the flow. We've got a 4-year centenary. We've got to unfold the story as it develops and understand that actually this is a complicated journey. But we didn't do that because Richard Dannett was right. This became, for many people, the thing that lit up the beginning of the centenary. Remembrance was the way in. And those poppies, which were to have been there temporarily, then toured the United Kingdom. I'm trying to remember where that is. Somebody will remember where it is, that photograph. But they went to Orkney, to Kirkwall. They went down to Plymouth. They cover the United Kingdom. And the Prime Minister himself intervened to enable that to happen. It became the route to education. And that, I think, is the point that I want to leave you with, because when I went with school parties to the Western Front, which I did on a number of occasions over the course of the centenary, many of the school pupils said to me things like, we need to do more remembrance. I'm amazed how often I heard that phrase, more remembrance. And I would say to them, what do you mean by remembrance? Because you don't remember this war. And they would say, well, we need to honor them and respect them. And one or two said we need to have more than 2 minutes silence. We need 10 minutes silence, so we genuinely reflect. That suggests, of course, that we haven't moved away from the idea of this war being dominated by loss of life, although the loss of life in the Second World War is, of course, considerably greater than the First, that we are concerned with the notions of futility and wastefulness still. But what I think the 4-year centenary enabled people to do was to move beyond the poppy, to ask themselves a bit more, at least on some occasions, what it was they were remembering. And I think also to distinguish between remembrance, which is, of course, a collective act, and memory, which we might describe as personal, but which actually none of us can now use to access the First World War, partly, of course, because we weren't there, but also because the things that trigger memories are very personal. Smell, particularly, of course, sight, sound. These are the things that can suddenly, spontaneously trigger things in our minds. And actually, if you're going to get close to this, you have to read, you have to engage the written word, and you have to understand it as a historical phenomenon. So it was a question of reverse engineering. Emotional engagement was the first point in, very often achieved at local level by small communities, by villages doing things, by churches doing things, by schools doing things, by colleges doing things, understanding the impact locally, and then realizing, as they looked at the dead, two things. First of all, many of those dead died in other theaters of the war than the Western Front, and that as they looked at the dead, they were also forgetting the living, particularly, of course, their mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, women who were left perhaps effectively as single parents, might have been working in war industries or whatever, and also the living in the sense of the 88% of those who put on uniform who returned home, the vast majority, in other words, who returned home, and who would be the ones that would initially shape the literature of the war. Have our understandings of this war in a wider scholarly sense been affected by the centenary? My short answer to that is it's too early to judge. Because if you think of the money that went into further research, I wish it were more, but the money that went into further research as a result of the centenary, the products that have come from that have only just started to appear. And I think we'll have a better handle on that by about 2025. Thank you very much.